To begin to answer this question, we first need to ask another question, which is, what is the relationship between people and the environment? So it's widely recognized now that human activity changes the environment. That can occur at a very local level. For example, in the case of mining, that creates a number of environmental harms in the process of extracting minerals, through to the global level. For example, how greenhouse gas emissions create climate change. But also very important is to then recognize that these environmental changes in turn create impacts back onto people and society. So a beginning point of thinking about our relationship between society and environment is to see a dynamic process that is a continual interaction between human action, environmental change, and then environmental change having impacts back onto society, requiring adaptation within society. Now, there are many different types of relationship with the environment, but in our current political economic system, it's market relations that are very much shaping the way in which humans connect to the environment and extract resources from it. So much of the environment in this case has become commodified. It's turned into resources that have market value and are sold into marketplaces, and overall this has accelerated resource use and accelerated therefore the rate of environmental change and impacts onto society. There are other aspects of people's relationship with the environment, though, beyond the political economy. For example, one key mediator of humans' relationship with the environment is what we know of it. In other words, environmental knowledge. People receive environmental knowledge in many ways, for example, through scientific studies, through the media, as well as through our own interaction with the environment and the knowledge that that creates. Overall, these different types of knowledges inform processes of environmental governance, and therefore knowledge is a very key factor in the way that we think about our relationship with the environment. At the present time, humans have changed the environment to such a degree that it's recognized that a geologically new age has emerged that has been labeled the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene refers to a period of time where humans have changed the world's environmental systems at the global scale. And this is the first time in geological history that humans have done this. One way to gain a perspective on the extent to which humans are having an impact on the environment is the concept of ecological footprint. More can be learned on the Footprint Network's website, but briefly, the concept of ecological footprint is a measure of the resource consumption and waste production that takes place within a country, within a city, or even by an individual. So this map shows that different countries globally have different ecological footprints on average, although it's important to recognize that within any country, there are vast differences between different groups as to who consumes much of the resources and who consumes relatively less. The overall picture that emerges from the ecological footprint measurements is that since the 1970s, the total resource consumption and waste production for humanity as a whole has exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet. And at present, about 1.7 times the amount of resources are consumed and waste produced than would be considered sustainable within the carrying capacity of the planet. Having established the extent to which humans have had an impact on the environment, I'd now like to share a couple of definitions of political ecology. So political ecology is now a well-established academic field of study that is very interdisciplinary. It draws on a range of different disciplines, including anthropology, sociology, international relations, environmental science, amongst many others. So an early definition of political ecology has been a field that combines the concerns of ecology and a broadly defined political economy. Together, this encompasses the constantly shifting dialectic between society and land-based resources, and also within classes and groups within society itself. Since this definition, the field of political ecology has grown very rapidly. A more recent definition by Michael Watts has been that political ecology aims to understand the complex relationship between nature and society through a careful analysis of what one might call forms of access and control over resources and their implications for environmental health and sustainable livelihoods. Research in political economy has helped identify new sets of relationships that matter if we are working towards achieving just and inclusive sustainable development. According to Paul Robbins, political ecology is a field of critical research predicated on the assumption that any tug on the strands of the global web of human environmental linkages reverberate throughout the system as a whole. So this insight is not surprising if we recognize how the processes of globalization increasingly connect distant places on the planet. So one obvious example of how places become connected is through economic systems, where sites of production and consumption are connected, as well as the financial flows that also enable those systems. But there are other examples of connections, such as the flows of knowledge increasingly through the internet, as well as flows of people that travel from place to place. And ultimately, the world as an environmental system is also highly interconnected from one place to the other. So this perspective of political ecology is important when we think about processes of environmental change, because it helps us recognize how decisions in one location may have consequences far away. So for example, rising demand for coffee in the countries of the north has encouraged production of coffee in places of the south that have had consequences also for the allocation of land use. In another example, a decision to build a fossil fuel-fired power station can have consequences not just locally but also globally, in the sense that it contributes towards global climate change. Political ecology research has also drawn attention to the processes by which environmental injustice occur. So it's widely recognized that environmentally harmful projects, such as waste dumps or industrial sites, often end up following a path of least resistance to be located within politically or economically marginalized communities. Oftentimes, some groups in society's voice and interests are heard or privileged over others, and in this sense, the discrimination may be institutionalized. There's now a large body of research on environmental injustice. In a textbook that was recently published by Gordon Walker, he highlights how environmental justice is the intertwining of environmental difference and social difference, and that we could disaggregate the processes of environmental injustice into its distributive, procedural, and recognitional dimensions. In terms of distributional injustice, this refers to how harms are distributed between different groups in society. For example, who is exposed to polluted air or polluted water, and who is not. Connected to this are procedural injustices. So this refers to how decision-making processes take place, and especially who is included and who is excluded. The third dimension is recognitional justice. So this refers to whether an environmental harm is even recognized as being a question of distributive and procedural justice or not. In the context of climate change, there's now also a global climate justice movement that highlights the injustice between those that are primarily responsible for creating climate change and those that are most at risk of its consequences. This also applies to the way in which the strategies on mitigation and adaptation are applied, where the projects that take place under them may create more risks for some groups than others. A research approach that political ecology has developed in order to understand these connections and the environmental justices or injustices that occur is the chain of causality approach. So this tries to connect decisions in one location to outcomes in another. An example that I've presented here briefly is related to the electricity system. So each time that there's a decision to turn on the electricity in a household, or electricity is used in an industrial process, it creates a demand that requires the generation of electricity in another locality. So if we think about this electricity generation through the lens of environmental justice, we recognize that different types of technologies create different types of environmental change and environmental impacts. And those in turn could have different types of harms onto people living nearby. So in the case of a coal-fired power station, turning on the electricity in one location creates a demand for the electricity that leads to the burning of coal, and before that, the mining. And each of those, depending on the techniques and technologies that are used, can create environmental pollution as well as impacts on human health. Or if the electricity came from a hydropower dam, then turning on the electricity in one location requires the damming of a river and the changing of the river system, including its ecology. In many places around the world, including Southeast Asia, there are many communities whose livelihoods depend upon river-based resources, whether it's for the wild capture fisheries or riverbank gardening or other types of agriculture. So again, electricity generation through hydropower can create impacts on river systems and the people who depend upon those rivers. Nowadays, there's a growing movement for renewable energy technologies that overall are far more environmentally benign than other technologies by which large amounts of power have been generated. However, that's not to say that all of these technologies are entirely harmless. For example, large solar farms require large areas of land and also water to clean the solar panels. So the point that I would like to emphasize here is that when we think about the electricity system through the lens of political ecology, then it makes us think about connections between places. But then moreover, as we start to think about the way that these systems change the environment and therefore also have impacts upon people whose lives depend upon the environment, we can also understand this in terms of environmental justice and essentially the winners and losers that are created through these systems and the decisions that lead to these systems being created.